The game has changed. The question is, have we? From my point of view, maybe sense-making has changed in our post-AlphaGo world. AlphaGo being the amazing moment that happened last year in terms of Google, thank you, Peter, and DeepMinds to produce something that I think shocked the world, quite honestly. It's an interesting question. When we actually built a deep learning system that could do what it did, how much does that actually cause us to step back and rethink what we do, who we are, and what does meaning actually mean? And my simple point is, in this world, I think we need new mindsets and maybe new lenses are required. So a fast flashback, our past context. Many of you heard me talk about this, but we almost all our corporate strategy was built on being able to leverage classical infrastructures around the notion of scalable efficiency. How do you build lots of stuff and then find ways to ship it out, assuming you guessed kind of correctly what the people wanted? This required a certain sense of being able to be predictable. We organized ourselves in hierarchies, organizational routines were the key, and we set out to minimize variance. That was basically it. Almost all corporate strategies are simple variants of that. Then the big shift happened, and we moved to New World, which we moved from the S-curves to basically exponentials, in terms of the continued exponential changes in what we can do with computation. More realistically, it actually is now we have very fast punctuated evolutions. Almost every 18 months, something is happening that's changing the game slightly. Some of these changes actually open up new paradigms that we have to be prepared to understand relatively rapidly, exploit if possible, and so on and so forth. One simple consequence of this, why many of us are here, yesterday's best practices are simply rapidly becoming totally outmoded. On top of that, our institutional architectures, the way we actually build large-scale organizations, and maybe even, Roy, our ways of knowing are actually need to be rethought. In fact, I'm very struck by a very popular book by a very cool guy named Kevin Kelly. His book recently, The Inevitable. The cycle of obsolescence is accelerating. The average lifespan of a phone app is a mere 30 days. I think it's probably shorter, but you won't have time to master anything before it is displaced. Some call this progress. We might come back and talk about that, if not. But let's take that and zoom out a moment. I want to explore this new world, post-AlphaGo, through three different lenses: an operational lens, an epistemological lens, and Roy, getting at what you said at the very end, an ontological lens. What does it mean to be in this kind of world? So let's start through an operational lens. Very simply, I was really struck when I grew up. My father said, John, as you march forward, think of yourself as a steamship. You decide where you're going, and you just power through one form of grit, anything, and you just, and I said, being a sailor a little bit, I said, Dad, I'm not sure. I think maybe I'd rather kind of become a sailor and be able to play with the winds, use naturally occurring forces to advantage. And, when you get blown off course a little bit, what do? You tack. And then I came to Silicon Valley, and I heard tacking is called pivoting. So what do? You pivot. But in fact, I think that is a great idea for the end of the 20th century, maybe the first 10 years of the 21st. I think we're living in a networked age that is really quite different. I think of it as a world having to do with whitewater kayaking. And I think many of us feel like we're in this flow as a whitewater kayaker. We can talk a lot about what does it mean to be a successful whitewater kayaker, and I think we can talk about that all day. But I think at a minimum, we begin to realize that this kind of era is no longer about just deepening individual expertise within a silo. In fact, today, it's much more of a question of how do I participate in these flows, these chaotic flows all around me? How do I surf them? How do I work with them? And how do I get embedded in them and stay balanced at the same time? If you're a kayaker, you have to understand, you really have to understand your own center of gravity, because you're going to go over. And part of the question is, how do you really know how to mobilize the forces in your body to be able to right yourself, and so on and so forth. And in some ways, I think all of us maybe don't do whitewater kayaking all the time, but feel ourselves caught up in this amazing turbulence around us. Critical skills in being a kayaker for this whitewater world. Maybe 3 very simple skills. How do you read the currents and disturbances of the context? If you are a whitewater kayaker, you learn to read context, or otherwise you're dead. It's as simple as that, depending on what your helmet is. So it's very interesting, how do you look at the kind of perturbations on the surface to read what's beneath the surface? How do you know how to play that? And in today's world, reading context may be at least as important as reading content. How do you interpret the flows for what do they reveal below? And I think likewise it's a question of how do you leverage the currents and the disturbances and these flows for amplified action. It's a question of how do we amplify our ability for agency in this kind of world. But guess what? Reading context ain't that simple. In fact, a lot of us have experienced this fairly recently, and we even have a talk later on this afternoon, I believe. A lot of us completely got Brexit wrong. A lot of us got Trump wrong. A lot of us thought we understood how to read the signals. We did not read context right. No matter how you look at it, there are parts of that context that we did not get. That's to say that data analytics can't do everything. Knowing what the key questions are becomes increasingly important. And part of this whole gathering is to figure out what the new questions are that we need to consider. That's simply to say that data ain't the same as information, it ain't the same as beliefs, and it ain't the same as value. We have to understand this intertwining of beliefs and values in a very major way. And I'm going to argue that to be able to do this, we have to rethink the power of imagination. Because the imagination is what enables us to escape the tyranny of the present. Almost all of our trainings are meant to extrapolate the present. The tyranny of the present. How do we begin to blast out of that? But it's also the fact, as Roy was saying, given this relentless pace of change and disruptions, maybe, just maybe, incremental learning would no longer suffice. We're all skilled at incremental learning. It's conceivable, given this big shift, that we're moving from an era of how do we participate in kind of authoritative knowledge assets, stocks of knowledge, taught to us on the stage by wise sage on the stage. How do we move to a world where the game is much more how do you participate in flows? How do you actually look at that swirl around us and participate in it? And here's part of the catch. If learning comes from participating in these flows, that means that much of what we're doing, we're creating tacit knowledge as much as anything else. We have not had time to decode or encode that knowledge into explicit structures. So suddenly we now live in a world where the tacit may be infinitely more important. And how do you capture and how do you communicate the tacit? It's not something you easily write in social networks. Something else is lurking behind the scenes here. So basically maybe, yes, scalable learning is critical, but maybe also unlearning old habits becomes even more important. How do we do that? I just want to take you through 2 quick examples of how we do that before we move into some deeper epistemological issues. One that really hit me is Jack Hittery, who I ran into by accident in Aspen. And he was addressing a bunch of CEOs. And he raised a very simple question to the room. How often do we get out of our own comfort zone? And getting out of our own comfort zone in a global world of constant change, may become more important than ever. How to do that? And I was really struck because Jack had built a practice, a very simple practice, a new habit that blew my mind. He said, what I do, John, is I will pick a new topic each year. In this case, it had to do with energy. I find a great conference to go to. And the first day, I attend every talk. The second day, I sit outside by the coffee. And I listen to the conversations going on, picking up the genre of talk. How does this professional community, so to speak, talk to and with each other? And then the third day, I will enter the conversation sitting out by the coffee pot. So first pick up the genre of interactions, and the third day, try it out. You've got to be willing to make yourself look like a fool very often. But it's very interesting to me because coming out of that 3 days that I was with Jack, some of you now know of Jack because from that conference, he did two amazing things. One is he went back and created the Cash for Clunkers program with Obama. And he also convinced Bloomberg to change the rules in terms of taxis in New York City. So it's very interesting that from those 3 days, with that habit, this new practice, he actually got enough to be able to actually make a significant change in our lives. But the catch, I think, is more generally, how do we actually think about honoring and amplifying serendipity? I won't bore you with all the kind of practices that may be around, but I say one of the things that each of us here does is we choose kind of an environment to engage in kind of serendipitous moments. We develop certain practices, and then we actually prepare ourselves to be able to act on those practices. That whole set of habits of being, I think, are becoming increasingly important. But at stake here is something very simple. How do we actually engage in deep listening? Deep listening through the walls of the silos that we are brought up in. Deep listening with reciprocity, so we actually give as well as take in terms of real communication, or as David Bohm would say, a new form of dialogue. Second example, this is the last of this kind, and I want to talk about the power of reverse mentorship. We have so much to learn from the kids. I'm going to call them the kids. And it's a strange experience, but as you, and can be very humbling. I want to just tell you a little story. I had stepped down from running Xerox Park at the time, and I decided I wanted to enter the world of games, game design. And I gave a talk, and in the on the panel was J.C. Hertz, who was the game editor for the New York Times. And we both gave pretty good talks, and she came up to me afterwards, and she said, John, that was a really great talk, but I can tell you don't understand shit. You got the top layer right, okay? But it's not you, you don't really get it. And I said, thank you, JC, this is a 23-year-old kid. And she said, but I tell you what, you seem to be clever enough and open enough that if you want, come apprenticeship with me. I said, you mean apprenticeship with you in New York City? She said, yeah. And I said, okay. And so she said, fly here. You got to do everything I say, and probably you spend enough time with this, about a year from now, you will be accepted by many of the great game designers in the United States. So I said, game on. And it turned out to be, one of the most shocking experiences of my life. Peter, you're used to some of this yourself, but, to sit there with these, this in particular case, this 20-year-old kid, I could barely see her face. She had so much metal on it. Lecturing me on exactly how you think about this kind of parsing of this particular game. I have, as you probably gather, became much more engaged in the World of Warcraft that I've written for a number of papers on since then. But it was kind of a sense of saying, we have so much to learn if we're willing to look stupid. But I come back to this because the rest of Kevin Kelly's quote is, we are now entering the world of being the endless newbie. And it's kind of a throwaway line, but it's not. So my previous couple of stories was meant to say, no, there is something about how do we take seriously being the endless newbie. So this is, I'm going to claim, the default, the new default for all of us in this room, no matter your age, your experience, your fields, and so on. And of course, a corollary to that, if we're going to be the endless newbie, that should keep us humble. So how do you, with humility, listen across the silos that we all brought up on to be able to find new ways to think? So this big shift, I want to argue, besides kind of looking at this more operationally in terms of the habits, we also have to step back and look at it epistemologically. How do we come to understand? In a curious way, going back to my older slide, I'm going to argue from an epistemological point of view, we must now be willing to constantly reframe our understanding of the world. Said somewhat differently, how do we come to understand, given this pace of change, and more interesting to me, the dense interconnectivity of everything? We used to be able to isolate things and learn about them in isolation. Maybe today that no longer works. No matter how fast we learn, incrementally, we must be willing to regrind our conceptual lenses. And Roy, I can't help but mention when you're sitting here, Piaget understood this in a new way, in terms of a different way, I should say, not a new way, long before me, is we're used to being able to assimilate things within our current frame. We ain't so good at breaking that frame. In psychology, we call that moving from assimilation to accommodation. We can always force fit almost anything to an old frame, but our real task is how do you construct the new frames? How do we take seriously accommodation in this new post-AlphaGo world? So I think it's fair to say that in these exponential, globally interlaced worlds, where everything is so densely interconnected, many of our problems have moved from being semi-linear problems to what you might call wicked problems. That is to say, these problems no longer are just complicated. Everyone in this room is used to dealing with complicated problems. But maybe we have to take seriously the fact that complex is not the same as complicated. These things are radically contingent. Going back to Pragmatic, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to almost everything else in the universe. There is no special sphere any longer of the environment, no distinct lands of oil, detached global economy, no separate issues of public health, and so on and so forth, as he brilliantly articulated in 2008 in his book, The Second World. If you go to the World Economic Forum, here's a very interesting risk map that was done in 2012 in terms of the fundamental global challenge having to do with governance. But that itself is tied into 4 or 5 other major issues that then become tied into even more things. So no longer are these problems kind of separatable. I think going back to the formal definition of a wicked problem is almost the case as soon as you start to solve them, they morph. I got into this not because I hunt the ways that spam works, but doing a lot of work for certain parts of the government in terms of how do you really think about terrorism in a new way. The catch-22 of wicked problems is you cannot learn about the problem without trying solutions. But every solution you try has lasting, unattended consequences that are likely to spawn new wicked problems. Example of wicked problems are galore, not the least of which we're experiencing day in and day out in this country. Global warming, financial crisis, and so on and so forth. These problems are deeply interconnected. You cannot attack the problems of homeless in any simple way. It's not until you actually get in and live in those communities do you understand where identities, how it gets constructed, and so on and so forth. We can do a lot of damage without understanding how intertwined some of these fundamental problems have become. I want to argue very simply, we need to move to new ways from mechanistic thinking to understand contexts, the problems that evolve, sets of exchanges with complex feedback loops galore. We got to think dynamic attractors, network affordances, and contextual propensities. Those of our guests from the East, more Asian, the whole notion that the shift from things and content to context, how do contexts have natural propensities in them? Because we're constructing new contexts all the time that have new types of affordances. How do we begin to play with those in brand new ways? Going to Karl Popper, I think a great inspiration for a bunch of us in this room. He says, think clouds, not clocks. One of the problems we have as a culture is we take clouds and pretend they're clocks. What does that mean? To understand a clock, what do? You take it apart. It's individual pieces, and you study each piece. And then you can understand, you think how the clock works. You can even put those pieces back together. A cloud is a fundamentally emergent dynamic system. You can't take apart. A cloud you study as a whole. That is a huge kind of epistemological shift. Perhaps, as James Cooper, Remo, is fond of saying that this whitewater world may now require a new sense, a seventh sense. Do we have to change our intuitions in a very interesting way when everything is so intertwined with each other? The seventh sense is the ability to look at any object and imagine the way in which it is changed by connections to other things. Whether you're commanding an army, running a Fortune 500 company, planning a great work of art, thinking about your children's education. These things are now enmeshed in so many other issues. How do you come to understanding that kind of enmesh, that kind of entanglement? If you're an economist, you're trained to think about these things as externalities. And we build brilliant, beautiful, linear models, but we've actually pushed everything aside and left only the simple to model. I think, you might say, in my own kind of way of looking at it, we now actually have a crisis of imagination, which goes to the heart, I think, what Media X is about. We need to see the ways that something is changed by being hyper-connected. Or even just plain normal connected, when connections are not obvious and making sense is elusive and can be often misleading. Let's look at a master, at how he uses imagination to make sense in this kind of world we're talking about. I want to go back and look at Sherlock Holmes. I want to kind of just capture one of his first interactions with Dr. Watson. Volume up.
Okay, you've got questions.
Yeah, where are we going?
Crime scene, next.
Who are you? What do you do?
What do you think?
I'd say private detective.
But
The police don't go to private detectives.
I'm a consulting detective. The only one in the world that invented the job.
What does that mean?
It means when the police are out of their depth, which is always, they consult me.
The police don't consult amateurs.
When I met you for the first time yesterday, I said Afghanistan or Iraq. You looked surprised.
Yes, how did you know?
I didn't know, I saw. Your haircut, the way you hold yourself says military. But your conversation as you entered the room
From my day?
said trained at Bart, so army doctor, obvious. Your face is tanned, but no tan above the wrists. You've been abroad, but not sunbathing. Your lips really bad when you walk, but you don't ask for a chair when you stand like you've forgotten about it. So it's at least partly psychosomatic. That says the original circumstances of the injury were traumatic, wounded in action then. Wounded in action, suntan, Afghanistan or Iraq.
You said I had a therapist.
Got a psychosomatic limp, of course you've got a therapist. And there's your brother. The phone, it's expensive, email-enabled MP3 player. You're looking for a flat share, you wouldn't waste money on this. It's a gift then. Scratch is not one, many over time. It's been in the same pocket as keys and coins. Mad City next people would treat as one luxury item like this. So it's had a previous owner. Next bit's easy, you know it already.
The engraving.
Harry Watson, clearly a family member who's given you his old phone. Not your father, this is a young man's gadget. Could be a cousin, but you're a war hero who can't find a place to live. Unlikely you've got an extended family, certainly not one you're close to. So, brother, it is. Now, Clara. Who's Clara? 3 cases says there's a romantic attachment. Expense of the phone says wife, not girlfriend. She to giving it to him recently. This model's only 6 months old. Marriage in trouble then. 6 months old, he's just giving it away. If she'd left him, he would have kept it. People do sentiment, but no, he wanted rid of it. He left her. He gave the phone to you. That says he wants you to stay in touch. You're looking for cheap accommodation, and you're not going to your brother for help. It says you've got problems with him. Maybe you liked his wife. Maybe you don't like his drinking.
How can you possibly know about the drinking?
Shot in the dark. Good one, though. Power connection, tiny little scuff marks around the edge of it. Every night he goes to plug it in to charge, but his hands are shaking. You never see those marks on the sober man's phone, never see a drunk's without them. There you go, see, you were right.
I was right. Right about what?
The police don't consult amateurs.
Not bad. What we really see here, though, is a kind of reasoning often called abductive reasoning, where you kind of imagine possible stories that suggest how something could have come about and then test them. We know about deduction, we know about induction, but possibly in today's world, abduction is going to be where the secrets lie that we're going to have to pay much more attention to. It is a form of sense-making where the facts often don't add up or contradict each other. How do we start to make sense in this kind of a world? Because this is not pure logic anymore. This goes back to how do you construct narratives that fit Occam's razor, and so on and so forth. This may be the way we come to understand more of what's going on. As a power or capacity of humans to form internal images of objects and situations, be they visual, auditory, tap dancing, etc., I want to come back to think about the imagination. In some ways, the imagination helps to close the gap between what is novel and what is known. It finds connections between things that are not obvious. It plays with boundaries. It lets partial thoughts jump fences. Go back and replay that movie. It engages in sense breaking, several examples, in order to make sense in a new way, to see new possibilities. And in seeing new possibilities, it actually helps us to escape the tyranny of the present. I think much of what we have to think about is how do we use imagination to escape the tyranny of the present. It goes to the heart of radical reframing. The notion of pragmatic imagination is something that some of you know that I've been doing a lot of work on with my colleague Ann Pendleton-Julian. Pragmatic, not practical. Pragmatic having to come from John Dewey, Charles Peirce, and so on, saying that they brought us the notion that all learning happens in action as an epistemological construct. We begin to realize that maybe imagination plays out across the entire spectrum, the cognitive spectrum, from how we do perception, how we do reasoning, how we do speculation, how we do experimentation, how we do free play. Don't worry, I'm not going to take you all down that. But kind of within the range of abductive reasoning, there seems to be a shift from normal sense-making to actually sense-breaking, where one widens the gap between what is known and then resolves it with the imagination. So most of us think about sense making as closing the gap. Maybe actually what we have to do is actually expand the gap before we try to close it. Expand it with the imagination and then try to close it in new ways. There's something very curious going on here. But this leads us to the issue of reframing. Because very often to reframe, you have to expand the gap before you start to close it again. Accommodation is not just a linear extrapolation of assimilation. Reframing ain't easy. One approach is to use imagination to break the normal frame by expanding the game, blah, blah, blah. I have to say, coming from many years at Xerox, I can tell you that getting a C-suite of any company to actually seriously undertake a radical reframe is nearly impossible. And it's one of the challenges we have, because if we come to a place like this, we understand perhaps the need for reframing, but how to do it and how to get anybody to buy into it. And I can take you a history of Silicon Valley companies. I won't even talk too much about Xerox or Kodak down the street from us in New York. I was, of course, out here. But, out here, our entire fight was to try to reframe the C-suite in where the document itself was really going. But I think the catch here is to realize that imagination is not just a fluffy add-on. It is not just relevant to the domain of the arts. I want to argue that imagination is absolutely crucial in sense-making, and even more so in sense-breaking and then sense-making. And that is, I think, our challenge here. So with that, I want to leap into the final stage of this, having to do with how do we move from just looking at this thing epistemologically to seriously looking at it ontologically. Ontologically means, what does it mean to be in this kind of a world? How do we construct a deeper understanding of a new way of being, I think, is something we should think about as we leave here the next 2 days. The unique power of the human imagination comes in part from its ability to integrate totally opposing qualities like emotion and reason, curiosity and certainty, and so on and so forth. How do we actually blend these kind of almost contradictory things? And I want to argue that as a kind of a beginning framework to think about how do we cultivate a new, might call it a blended ontology, is to step back a moment and understand Homo sapien, man is knower, Homo faber, man is maker, and Homo ludens, man who plays. And everyone in this room is deeply embedded in the relationship between Homo sapien and Homo faber. You actually start to learn by doing things and seeing how they work and they don't work and so on and so forth. But almost nobody takes seriously Homo ludens, man as player. And yet if you really think about it, and Huzangi was famous for writing a beautiful book on this, is that culture actually evolves under the guise of Homo ludens. How do I figure out how to break the systems? How much play is there in the system? How much can I push the system? How much of these entanglements can be pulled apart? And so on and so forth. There's a sense of playing this that's a little bit different than playing a normal game, although if you play Go, you can see some of this happening as well. But there is something very interesting about how do you get a feel for something by seeing how it pushes back. And how you kind of, even go out in a fast car, how do you figure out the play you have on that wheel, how fast you can, how you can break I shouldn't say this tire's free, discouraged in California, but there's a certain sense of kind of playing with in order to kind of help you to break sense in order to be able to reframe. But I really want to argue that the imagination is what starts to combine in quite different ways, again, along that spectrum, in terms of man is knower, man is maker, and man is player. And in fact, the imagination reigns supreme in some ways when you come to the Homo ludens. But thus far, I've been talking just within the individual. And it's interesting that I want to suggest that in this constantly changing world, we may actually move from a state of being, which is what a lot of psychology would tell us about, to a state of becoming. If we take this field of constant flux seriously, maybe it says that we have to think about a new ontology, a new way of being, where we are constantly becoming. And if you can kind of own constantly becoming, suddenly change, constant change, becomes a friend or an adventure in an interesting way. There's something curious looking around here. I can't claim that we totally have this mapped out, right? But this idea of moving from a state of being to a state of constantly becoming is an interesting twist that is almost like a riddle. Try playing with that in your own mind's eye. But let me complicate it. How might we actually take that blended ontology and take seriously where deep learning is going and machine learning and things like this and AI? How do we actually include now kind of intelligent augmentation or artificial intelligence into this blended ontology? A quick sub-story, and then to wrap this up, think about freestyle chess. We all know that, in fact, we can build amazing chess machines that beat the hell out of any experts. But what isn't talked about very much is the whole notion of freestyle chess, where basically, in this particular story I'm going to talk about, because these terminus happen all the time, where basically Zach, and in freestyle chess you got to play by the rules, but you can use whatever augmented technologies you want. What happened here, which by the way has come very close to how the special ops really work in the Navy SEALs, is that what you really do is you hook somebody with a tremendous imagination up with a geek. And look, if these two folks work shoulder to shoulder enough, how they can build something brand new where the imagination can run free, but then you count on the guy with the computer to be able to check through some of this. So I think this whole sense becomes very interesting. And if you now go back to this blended ontology, how do we actually now think about how this plays out differently, where I augment human knowing in a simple way, but different way than how I do it in human Faber. And Homo ludens is now, how do you actually have this kind of duality between the geek and the imaginative person? And the beauty of that particular example of freestyle chess, if you actually see how they work together, or if I took you to the field of special operations in the military, it is astounding now how the geek and the operative work seamlessly together. So they're constantly complementing each other to almost a new state of being. It's easy to think about that, somewhat easy to think about that, in terms of how do I augment the individual that is a blend of these knowing, making, and playing. I just want to kind of end with thinking about one addition to that, is how might one now realize that these tools that we're dealing with are themselves part of a much more complex network world, and all of us, whenever we do anything, are all connected to others as well. How do you create kind of a sense of a distributed community of practice that has a sense of indwelling enough to be able to create something quite new called a networked imagination. Something to think about, we can talk about later. In thinking about this, I do want us to encourage us not to be naive, because if we do this augmentation, both individually and collectively, the data and the algorithms that we're using here tend to operate as black boxes, especially when done with deep learning systems, let alone the ethics underlying the advice and the actions. So perhaps the final thing we have to think about is how do we actually make sense of what this new blended ontology is actually individually or collectively capable of doing, or in terms of the black boxes that we use to run our own organization or our own devices. And sense-making here becomes interesting, because it's a bit tricky these days. The old techniques don't really hack it. Here is somebody trying to investigate what are the biases, what are the ethics embedded in the autonomous vehicles. And it's a beautiful little cartoon of calling in a psychoanalyst to analyze this. Perhaps more seriously, how do we come to make sense when basically these systems, we're used to talking about what's embedded in the algorithms, but in these deep learning systems, much of the game has to do with how we collected the data. What is the data? Here's a case where this loan was denied. There's no redlining, if you Americans know what that more or less is, which is outlawed. But the data that was being used to train this system had all the results of redlining a long time ago. And in a curious sort of way, without kind of interesting social scientists in the game here, we're unaware of what the biases were in the way that the data was originally collected, which then led to behavior, which, being on the board of directors of some of these companies, actually become questionable. Because as we're supposed to exercise fiduciary responsibility, we got to make sense in a brand new way, and don't count on the accounting firms to be able to help you understand this kind of problem. So I want to end with a beautiful piece of work talking about the blind spot in AI research by Kate and Ryan. A social systems analysis is needed that draws on the philosophy, law, sociology, anthropology, and science and technology studies, especially with respect to the curation of data used to train these types of deep learning systems. The curation of data is something we now need to make sense out of, which is yet a new important challenge. Only by asking, as says Kate, broader questions about the impacts of AI can we generate a more holistic and integrated understanding. Our challenge today is one of sense-making in a world that won't stay stable for our standard sense-making strategies to be effective. Most of our pressing problems, I'm simply going to assert, are wicked. Our tools are increasingly opaque. Our models and frames, by and large, are fundamentally outdated. We need to escape the tyranny of the present and meet head-on the crisis of imagination. Thank you.